heart and mind embraces all day through.
Welcome to the 7th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. From D-Day to Operation Market Garden to the Battle of the Bulge, Robert Bowen saw a lot of action in World War II before he was injured and taken prisoner of war at the Battle of the Bulge. He survived parachuting from the gliders nicknamed Flying Coffins because of their high casualty rates, combat, and a harrowing experience as a POW, during which time he was lost to his beloved wife, Christine. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II. From the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites that we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in the reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based on the book. Robert Bowen of Linthicum Heights, Maryland, served with Company C, 401st Glider Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division with glider and parachute soldiers. But on D-Day, because of his shortage of planes and gliders, Bowen and the men he led as assistant squad leader landed on Utah Beach by a landing craft vehicle, personnel boat, also known as a LCVP or Higgins boat. As the ramp of the LCVP dropped with a splash, Lieutenant Aspinwall looked Bowen sternly in the eyes and said, "Let's kill some Germans, Sergeant." Once in the ice-cold, chest-deep water, Bowen struggled to wade the 100 yards to get ashore. As German shells racked the area, he was almost pulled down by the weight of his gear. Bowen recalled, "We passed some LCVPs, floating bodies and life preservers, knocked out trucks and tanks to reach a beach with many dead and wounded." Once on the beach, Bowen followed others to a 10-foot hole in the seawall. "A string of bodies lay in my path, a man with nothing but a bloody glob for a face, another looking as if he were still asleep." Upon reaching the hole, Bowen found it partially blocked by a stalled tank and bodies. Following a causeway which led inland, Bowen saw more stalled tanks and trucks, their occupants huddling in ditches, trying to avoid the incoming shell fire. Bowen was startled by an even more ghastly sight. "I could see high poles with teller mines on top, anti-glider defenses, and signs in German saying Achtung Minion, danger, mines. An American lay prone in ankle-deep wire, both hands missing, the middle of his body a bloody hole, and a string of entrails strung out behind him." Bowen's objective was to establish a base for the division, which had been dropped by parachute and glider the previous night. On their march to St. Marie-du-Mont, Bowen's unit encountered some German resistance. They opened fire on a group of Germans moving through the brush, but they didn't pause long enough to engage in a firefight with them. Bowen's stomach turned when he discovered a group of 9 German soldiers lying in a ditch along the road. All had been shot through the back of their head, their foreheads blown out. It had been cold-blooded slaughter, completely unnecessary. The American paratroopers that had landed there the night before had obviously taken no prisoners. On D-Day +1, Bowen's 401st was just north of Sainte Marie du Mont when they heard the roar of airplane motors and saw a glider infantry unit coming in for the landing, no more than 200 feet above them. Bowen was glad he wasn't one of the glidermen on board. "The Jerrys saw them, too, opening up with every weapon they had. The gliders were cut loose. They began their descent to fields just around us. They came in skidding and flopping around like awkward albatrosses, most crashing headlong into the hedges. As the emergency glidermen hit the ground, we tried to cover them, firing and shouting for them to come in our direction. That any of them made it was a small miracle, but they did. They formed on the road and they marched away, taking some wounded with them." Bowen fractured his right ankle when he was thrown into a ditch by a rocket explosion. Refusing evacuation, he fought on in several more battles. He explained, "I was determined the ankle wasn't going to keep me out of the most important thing I had ever done, so I went on, limping, but I was able to keep up." Bowen described the carnage on the battlefield along the main road running from Sainte Marie du Mont to Vierville and on to Saint-Côme-du-Mont. "We passed dead troopers and chutes hanging from trees. An American jeep overturned on 4 of our men, their bodies turning gray. Then a string of dead German bicycle troops, as many as 15, their bicycles cluttering the ditches. Some had been shot through the back of the head. Off to either side in the gentry rolling fields were gliders which had dead GIs around them. A platoon of Sherman tanks was stopped temporarily on the main road by a particularly ghastly sight. A young dead GI paratrooper lay in the middle of the road, still in his chute, and blood and brains oozing from beneath his helmet. The tank wouldn't move until someone moved the body, and those around it seemed too sickened to touch it." Eventually, Bowen's Captain Towns insisted that Bowen have a doctor take a look at his ankle. Not taking no for an answer, Towns flogged down a doctor. By now, Bowen's ankle was so swollen that he couldn't even remove his shoe. The doctor insisted Bowen be evacuated to an aid station to have it looked at. Sniper fire and mortar rounds harassed Bowen as he rode on a trailer towed by a jeep with several other ambulatory patients riding on it. Along the way to the aid station, towards Hayesville, the jeep came to a small village, with troops of the 4th Division moving through the town to the north. Bowen could hear the mortar shells exploding from the battle that lay just ahead of the division. A knocked-out German tank was said to be blocking the road ahead of the jeep. The driver waited for the platoon to pass until mortar shells began dropping, then told the ambulatory wounded to take cover in the ditches. Bowen watched helplessly from the ditch what happened next. A scared young second lieutenant passed us. A shell hit in the middle of the road, right among the platoon. Men were bowled over into the ditches. Some screamed, reminding me of hogs that I had seen butchered when I was young, something which sickened me, but which made my uncle and cousins laugh at my queasy stomach. Our doctor and driver ran to help, working like mad to patch up the wounded. They brought one man back to the jeep, one of his legs hanging by a few tendons. The doctor did as much as he could. He wrapped him in a blanket and he slid him on the only vacant litter. The doctor told the driver to head back. As Bowen rode on the back of the medical trailer, he felt like a spectator as he witnessed unbelievable sights. Planes flying from all directions over Omaha Beach, bombs exploding, and the sounds of small arms and mortar fire from individual battles. Finally, the driver announced they were there, not at the aid station, but at the division hospital. Bowen's ankle was worse than he thought. The doctor suspected he had fractured it, but didn't have an x-ray machine to tell for certain. The ankle was so badly swollen that he had to cut off Bowen's combat boot. Bowen was helped by a medic to an open shed where he was told to sleep for the night. Bowen and another injured man wrapped themselves for comfort in a pile of discarded parachutes. Several badly injured German soldiers had also been placed in the same shed, and their moaning through the night kept Bowen awake. I didn't know until the next day that for these men there was no tomorrow. They were left there to die because nothing more could be done for them but to keep them heavily dosed with painkiller until they died. Bowen was eventually given a wound ticket for evacuation. As a medical jeep returned him to the beaches of Normandy, Bowen passed a steady stream of tanks, trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, every sort of vehicle the army possessed. But it was the troops they passed that stood out. Anxious, faced, and wondering, "How is it up there?" one cried to us. "No sweat, you'll get used to it," a trooper yelled back, untruthfully. When they finally arrived to the evacuation site, Bowen found a chaotic scene at the beach. It was a shambles, with troops and material pouring ashore and across the sand and incoming shells still pounding it with regularity. Men worked there in feverish pitch. Offshore, a destroyer lobbed shells in the direction of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, and another curried around taking pot shots at floating mines which had broken loose from the moorings. Bowen was glad to be evacuated from the beach, with its sickening smell of burnt wood, dead men, cattle, and gunpowder, on a duck before being transferred to a tank landing ship for the trip across the channel. The men aboard another LCT alongside Bowen's craft were not as lucky. That LST hit a floating mine, and it sunk within minutes, taking with it all of its wounded men. Eventually, Bowen reached the 4,177th Hospital in Birmingham, where he convalesced in the orthopedic ward. X-rays revealed that his ankle was not broken, but that he had twisted and torn his ligaments and tendons by walking on it while it was injured. His ankle was first wrapped, then put into a soft cast. After a 3-week stay in the hospital, Bowen was sent to division headquarters at Greenham Lodge, where he stayed until his glider company got back. He also got his first real news about how his glider company had fared since D-Day from the company clerk, Cleon Overbay, who had remained behind in England. Bowen was mortified by the losses. "We had about 45% casualties, but other units had more than 55%. I lost some good friends there. My platoon leader, Second Lieutenant John Aspinwall from Staten Island, a wonderful person and a great guy, killed by machine gun fire. Sergeant Freddie Grethel, killed by a sniper, a fun-loving guy who liked to clown around in the barracks. Staff Sergeant Frankie DeMarco from Detroit, a wife and 2 kids who wanted in the worst way to go home to them. Second Lieutenant Rat Carsey, the weapons platoon leader, had been wounded and evacuated to a LST, as had Private First Class Louis Wofford, and the LST hit a mine while leaving the beach and sank with all of its crew and wounded. There were other deaths, of course, but none affected me like those mentioned. All the romance for war that I had harbored as a kid from reading about World War I and playing soldier burst like a bubble. I knew I was not invulnerable, that witnessing the pain and suffering seen on the battlefield and in the hospital was a reality which struck me like a blow. By the time Bowen's unit had been pulled out of Normandy to prepare for another invasion in France, the company had lost every officer except Captain Towns, and he was ailing, and all the platoon sergeants except Yasser O'Guin. C Company would never feel the same again to Bowen without the men he had respected and hoped to return home with. For Bowen, the war had become an unspeakable nightmare. Still in England, Bowen's morale was lifted along with the rest of the men in Company C when it was announced the glider troop would receive hazard pay, jump boots, and a glider badge. They were also given a 7-day furlough. Of course, the glidermen understood that the Army must have been feeling a bit guilty after D-Day's heavy glider casualties. However, the morale boost the additional pay and recognition provided for the glidermen was short-lived due to a series of alerts calling for possible invasions, which never materialized. C Company was supposed to participate in invasions of Belgium, termed Linnet 1 and Linnet 2, which were called off at the last minute due to General Patton's rapid advances through Europe. Just before dawn, on September 17, 1944, Robert Bowen, now promoted to squad leader, once again loaded into his glider with his men as part of Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. The gliders were hooked to the tow planes by nylon rope. Because there were so many planes and gliders crowded together in such a small place, the ropes were coiled like rolls of spaghetti. When the tow planes took off, they yanked the gliders off with a mighty jerk, which Bowen described as bone shaking. Once again, the gliders lived up to their names as flying coffins, and they flew over the channel. The rope of one unlucky glider broke loose. Bowen watched helplessly as it gently glided downwards before making a tremendous splash and promptly sinking like a stone in the ocean water. Soon another glider, an English Hamilcar, also broke loose. Because it was carrying a small tank, the men noted that it sank even faster. The glider men were in the air for over 3 hours before they reached the landing zone. By now, some of the men were getting airsick, and they puked into their helmets. Bowen described the odor and the stench from the plane's motors was sickening. The German soldiers, who could be seen on the ground below, running from their buildings with weapons in their hands, soon took the glidermen's minds off the smell. Bowen flinched as a loud crack sounded right beside his head. A bullet had torn through the glider's fabric between Bowen's head and another gliderman's before it passed through the roof. "It was close," he recalled, and both men grinned weakly. The men soon counted 13 bullet holes that had ripped through the glider. Finally, the gliders were released about 40 miles behind German lines, north of Eindhoven. "We were going about 90 miles per hour when the pilot banged the release knob in free flight and making a long turn in a field crowded with gliders and equipment. Small arms fire rattled, mortar and artillery rounds sending up clouds of black smoke. Bowen's glider hit with a crash, bouncing several times before it finally stopped. The men bailed out as quickly as they could, aware that the other gliders were preparing to land in the crowded field. Bowen recalled the chaotic scene. 2 gliders hit together head-on in the air, came down in a crash. Men were screaming in the ball of wreckage, but that was for someone else to clean up. Overhead, the air was filled with planes and gliders. Bursting, ack-ack. Planes were hit, erupting trails of flames. Men jumped, white chutes marking their paths. Some had it fully open when the men hit the ground. Other men who landed were running from the edge of the fields to get out of the paths of the incoming gliders. Many lay erect up on their noses, or with their wings drooping like broken kites. It was Bowen's first and only combat glider landing. He had survived, but others were not nearly as lucky. Of the 14 gliders transporting his company, 3 were already missing. The 401st was tasked with securing and protecting Landing Zone W the following morning as the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 327th brought in more supplies. Bowen had a front row seat as over 2,500 men, 140 jeeps, 100 trailers, and 2 bulldozers arrived by gliders and planes for Operation Market Garden. On D-Day plus 1,428 of the 450 gliders that took off from England made it to Landing Zone W. The gliders that flew on D-Day plus 2 did not fare nearly as well. Bad weather and dense fog wreaked havoc on the gliders. Of the 385 that took off from England, only 209 made it to Landing Zone W. The gliders landed all through the afternoon. The Jerries didn't put up much opposition. A few mortar and artillery shells, and later in the day, a 20-millimeter ack-ack, which they fired from deep in the woods. Recovering teams from our battalion were going through the gliders, removing supplies and injured men. Bowen and Sergeant Trudeau searched several gliders, hoping to find some Thompsons, or at least a few handguns. They came back empty-handed, but not alone. Halfway across the field, I heard the angry roar of a fighter plane engine, then the rattle of machine gun fire. I dove for the ground as puffs of dirt erupted ahead of me. The plane flashed by, a ME-109. I took off again as another plane roared in. I hit the ground again. The second plane was a British Hawker, Typhoon guns belching as it hung on the German's tail. Its bullets were the ones plowing up the ground near me. On D-Day +3, Bowen watched in horror as a German fighter, Messerschmitt 109, was more accurate in its aim. The Messerschmitt shot down 3 C-47s in just a few seconds. It was a terrible sight to see them go down in flames, men jumping but at too low an altitude for their chutes to open, Bowen recalled. Initially, Operation Marketplace met with great success. Eindhoven was taken by the 506th on the 18th, with the 502nd taking Best and the 501st taking Vechel. The road had been opened for the British Second Army towards Arnhem, but the victories were short-lived. At Arnhem, the British would find themselves facing 2 SS Panzer divisions, which had been alerted of the invasion plans prior to D-Day. With the British trapped at Arnhem, the only way they could be saved was by sending reinforcements using the road. However, the Germans had mounted strong defenses all along the corridor to block the reinforcements. The battle began to reach the British at Arnhem. However, they couldn't hold out, and we reached the Rhine too late. Afterwards, the battle centered around the road from Belgium to the Rhine, the Germans trying to cut it, and we trying to drive them away. We fought at Vechel, Nijmegen, and finally along the Rhine, Zetten, Offisten, Randwijk. We lost about 50% of our men. There were no replacements for their casualties. At Vechel, the 3rd Platoon endured the most horrific barrage of artillery Bowen faced during the entire war. For more than an hour, the artillery barrage went on, hammering the town of Vechel, but fortunately overshooting the men of the 3rd Platoon, who had dug foxholes around the perimeter of the town. Bowen tried to make sense of the senselessness as he watched Vechel burn. There are people in there, Dutch civilians, American and British troops, paying the price for liberation. I thought about our price so far, the deaths of Omilia and Mazur, both young and eager. Omilia had been reading his Catholic prayer book minutes before he was blown apart. It made me wonder, was it a failed answer to his prayers or a belief in nonsense? I couldn't get it out of my mind as I watched the city burning. Ultimately, Operation Marketplace was a failure. The primary objective, capturing the bridge at Arnhem, forcing the German flank to be turned, was thwarted by the 2 SS Panzer divisions. Bogged down by the wet, muddy fields and the constant barrage of German 88s inflicting tremendous losses, the British 30 Corps failed to advance the 65 miles to the Rhine. Recognizing his grand strategy had failed, Field Marshal Montgomery never again challenged General Eisenhower's war plans. Any hope that the war might be over by the end of 1944 was vanquished with the defeat of Operation Market Garden. Although Bowen had hoped his gliders would be returned to England after the operation, they were instead assigned on September 28th to the British 12 Corps, which needed help holding the ground they had claimed south of the Rhine. A week later, Bowen lost both his platoon leader and platoon sergeant in a grisly fight. On October 8th, while we were on patrol in German territory, my platoon leader, First Lieutenant Howard Cole, and his platoon sergeant, Technical Sergeant Frank Trudeau, a Cajun from New Orleans, were killed in a firefight, as well as our medic, Private First Class Stanley Clark. I managed to evacuate Lieutenant Cole and some others who had been wounded under heavy enemy machine gun and rifle fire. We had run into a platoon of Germans in an apple orchard, and Trudeau would not take my advice to pull out before we got chewed up. When he finally did, it was too late. Cole and Clark were killed during the pullout, as well as Trudeau. Trudeau, a Bronze Star recipient for his heroism at Normandy, had a penchant for collecting souvenirs on the battlefield. It had nearly gotten him killed a few weeks earlier when he was searching a ditch filled with Germans for souvenirs when 9 live Germans popped up. Lucky for Trudeau, The 9 Germans quickly surrendered to his Thompson gun. Bowen recalled, "He was lucky that time, and he knew it. Yet it didn't cure his thirst for more booty, a thirst which would be the death of him for not too long afterwards." Unfortunately, Trudeau was often fearless to the point of being reckless. Bowen would tease him that maybe 1 Bronze Star wasn't enough. Trudeau seemed to be going for a silver one, too. Sergeant Trudeau had organized a night patrol to go across 2 narrow canals into an apple orchard where they had been fighting earlier to look for abandoned equipment. Bowen went with him, along with 8 other men. As they walked single file across wide boards which had been placed over the canals, the men didn't expect to find any Germans left in the orchard. However, Bowen soon spotted the flat tops of the helmets and several foxholes and pointed them out to the still disbelieving Trudeau. When Bowen took prisoner 1 young German who came face to face with his Thompson, Trudeau reluctantly accepted that there were plenty of Germans in the orchard, easily outnumbering them. Trudeau brought up the rear as the patrol withdrew the way they came from the orchard. When Trudeau spotted some abandoned German equipment, Schmeisser machine pistols, he couldn't resist. He went back for them and was hit by a German machine gun fire as he did so, the souvenirs costing Trudeau his life. Having placed 3 men in slit trenches to give cover until the rest of the platoon had returned, Bowen had gone back to his foxhole to get something to eat. When he heard the shots, he ran back and learned that Trudeau had been hit. "I could see Trudeau's body, lying flat with a Thompson near his extended hand," Bowen wrote. Trudeau's close friend in the platoon, Abe Spector, insisted on crawling out to see if Trudeau was still alive. Bowen considered it suicide to do so, with the machine gun fire still ripping across the orchard, but agreed to give Spector what cover he could when it became clear that there was no way to stop him. Spector managed to crawl out to Trudeau, felt his neck, and confirmed he was dead. Grabbing Trudeau's Thompson, he crawled back to Bowen and told him the sad news. A mortar squad from the platoon arrived and began firing on the Germans. The platoon medic, Stanley Clark, had not been told that Trudeau was dead. He too crawled out to check on him and was hit by machine gun fire, falling into a shell hole. The disaster continued. First Lieutenant Howard Cole, the leader of the 3rd Platoon, now ran towards the firefight. Bowen described Lieutenant Cole as a friendly, reasonable man who, in spite of the war, smiled a lot ever since his wife wrote him that she was pregnant with their first child. As Bowen ran up, he stopped, peering into the orchard, searching for the enemy. Bowen yelled out to Cole, "Get down, Lieutenant! For Christ's sake, get down!" Bowen's warning was too late. Shots ripped into Lieutenant Cole as he crumbled onto the road. Bowen crawled over to him. "He knew he was badly hurt. He pleaded with me not to leave him. I told him I wanted. I said I'd need some men to carry him out." Bowen called to another squad, who sent 3 men to help carry Lieutenant Cole off the battlefield. Then Bowen crawled with several of his men up the ditch alongside the orchard, and they began blasting the Germans with all the fire they could muster. During the firefight, Private First Class Lyle Apple, a young replacement from Volga, South Dakota, went down, shot across the stomach, with his entrails popping out. When 1st Platoon heard the combat, their leader, Lieutenant Robert Wagner, ran up to see what was happening. He advised Bowen to get everyone out of the orchard vicinity. Bowen did so, communicating to the machine gunners to give them cover by ripping the orchard with fire. They managed to bring Lieutenant Cole and Apple with them as they withdrew. With the platoon now withdrawn from the orchard and angry over the casualties they had suffered, Lieutenant Wagner ordered 81mm mortars and artillery fire into the orchard. At first his order was refused because the orchard was still less than 100 yards from their position. However, a British captain ordered the shells, which hit on target, exploding in great mushrooms of smoke and flame. When the mortar barrage ended, a white flag was waving in the orchard. 6 Germans emerged, heading for us, and the deep ditch. Rafferty's men gunned them down. After seeing Lieutenant Cole and Sergeant Trudeau both mowed down, 3rd Platoon was in no mood for taking prisoners, angrily violating the rules of war. After the firefight, Bowen felt crushed mentally and physically. I was overwhelmed by guilt because I couldn't have done more. Bowen tried to process what had happened with another soldier named Hans. The two men learned after the battle that Trudeau had been given specific orders to avoid the orchard and couldn't understand why he had decided to take the patrol there. Hans told Bowen that Trudeau had thought he was invincible. Bowen asked him why. Hans replied, "In Normandy he did a foolish thing, running headlong at a German machine gun pistol and wiping it out. It wouldn't happen again in a million years, but he didn't believe that." Now Bowen tried to grapple with the fact that Trudeau, their medic Clark, and Lieutenant Cole were all killed over a couple of German machine pistols. Worse still, the 2nd Platoon was pinned down by the Germans for weeks alongside the orchard. Because the sector was too hot, Bowen could not even retrieve the bodies of his friends Clark and Trudeau. They laid where they had fallen for weeks, decaying in front of their bodies. For Bowen, it was an agonizing sight. Every time I looked over and I saw them, a wave of desperation went through me. The bodies lay there for 23 days. To add the terrible odor coming from the dead cattle and bodies of the enemy. It is a smell one never forgets, an odor which permeated the clothing and the mind. At dusk the next evening, Bowen was informed that he had been ordered to take over 3rd Platoon from Lieutenant Cole, who had been killed. Bowen didn't think it was possible. After all, he was only a buck sergeant. There were other men in the platoon who were already staff sergeants. But Lieutenant Wagner assured him, "I've already talked to them. They agree that it is the best solution and will back you 100%. If you need any advice or help, just ask for it. I'll be only too glad to help." Like it or not, Bowen was now a lieutenant. From that time on, until we left Holland on November 30th, I acted as platoon leader. We went to Camp Mermillon-le-Grand in Reims, France, to rest and refit after 57 days on the line. Bowen wrote, by the time Bowen's 2nd Platoon left Holland, it had suffered nearly 50% casualties. The 2nd Platoon's much-deserved rest in Reims was short-lived, as the unit was soon rushed to Bastogne when the Battle of the Bulge broke out just a few weeks later. Robert Bowen had been a seasoned staff sergeant by now in the 401st Glider Infantry by the time the Battle of the Bulge broke out. Bowen's glider and parachute unit had been given the rest at Camp Mermillon-le-Grand in Reims, France, after 57 days of combat in Normandy and at the failed Operation Marketplace. The rest had been much needed, as the men were both physically and emotionally exhausted. The loss of so many comrades had a mental effect on everyone, so it is safe to say that the stress of combat ate at everyone's guts. When the Battle of the Bulge started, Bowen's unit was rushed to Bastogne, where we were surrounded the night after our arrival. The Battle of the Bulge was extremely cold, and most of the GIs did not have adequate winter clothing. Bowen remembered it snowed about 10 to 12 inches on December 20th, and a strong northwest wind whipped over the rolling hills, making our foxholes freezers. Bastogne had been surrounded on December 18th, and both food and ammunition were scarce. Robert Bowen's Company C of the 401st Glider Infantry held the western flank's farthest sector during the Battle of the Bulge. I was a platoon leader, and after a hard battle on the 20th to eliminate a platoon of Germans who had just moved in behind us during the night and cut and blocked the road, we were ordered to support our 2nd Platoon, which came under a heavy attack by 12 German tanks and infantry in snowsuits. The battle raged all day, with a Sherman tank and a tank destroyer with us, which were knocked out, and many of our men became casualties. Still, Bowen believed Company C would have held their position at Mont-du-Saint-Étienne if the artillery had been able to support them. The enemy tanks were less than 200 yards away, and we had a trained observer with us, but our artillery did not have the ammo to knock out the tanks. So besides being cold, hungry, and mentally fatigued, our position fell. The first time in our company history that we lost men as POWs. Bowen himself became a POW when he was taken prisoner on December 23rd in the small town of Flemu Ridge near Mondusantillon, Belgium. As Staff Sergeant of Company C, 401st Glider Infantry, Bowen and his men had engaged in a hard battle on December 20th to eliminate a platoon of Germans who had moved in behind them during the night and had blocked the road. Next, they were ordered to support the 2nd Platoon, which came under a heavy attack by 12 German tanks and infantry in snowsuits. The battle raged all day with a Sherman tank and a tank destroyer. I was wounded about 1,600 and put in the basement of a house behind our position, which served as an aid station. The position was declared hopeless, and the company withdrawn at nightfall. Unfortunately, the house had been cut off. All wounded, some members of the tank and destroyer crews, and a few from the company were captured. The next day, Bowen was operated on in a German first aid station, where shrapnel was removed from his abdomen and his right wrist. His wounds necessitated several subsequent surgeries. During one of Bowen's surgeries at a clearing hospital at Euskirchen, Germany, just west of Bonn, an Allied air raid dropped a bomb alongside the German hospital. The explosion infuriated the German doctor, who began strangling Bowen, even as he lay on the operating table. Bowen was spared when an American who was also badly wounded in the leg pulled the doctor off me. After the raid, the doctor apologized. As a wounded POW, Bowen was moved around a lot. He spent nearly a month at the clearing hospital in Eiskirchen, then another month at Hoffenstahl Lazaret, before being sent to Lemberg 12A. From there, Bowen endured a 7-day train ride in a boxcar filled with 70 men to Bremerhaven, Bremerhaven. There were no toilet facilities except for a small can, and food was limited to a Red Cross parcel split between 2 men with a can of water. Men died. Others went insane in the car after it was strafed by our planes. During the ride, when there wasn't enough room to lie down, half the men stood for 2 hours while the other half sat. I developed phlebitis in my right leg. It turned into thrombophlebitis, and that into a pulmonary infection. Bowen would spend the rest of the war in a surgical ward at Bremerhaven. Bowen found the conditions as a POW deplorable. Personal hygiene was impossible to keep up with without soap, towels, shaving equipment, and hot water. The POWs did not even have toilet paper. They were given 1 blanket and a lice-filled straw to sleep on. As a result, all of the POWs were covered with body lice. Food was scarce. Breakfast consisted of a cup of coffee and 2 slices of black bread. Dinner was generally a cup of soup. During the last 2 months of the war, when Bowen was in a Stalag hospital, Red Cross parcels began arriving, and the POWs began to eat a little better. But it wasn't enough for Bowen, who lost 50 pounds as a POW. Bowen wrote, "The deplorable living conditions turned minor injuries into those which became life-threatening." Bowen's spirits undoubtedly would have improved had he received an occasional letter from home, but his wife had received a letter telling her that her husband had been killed in combat. "As a POW, I was unable to contact my wife, telling her I was safe," Bowen explained. As a result, Christine thought I had been killed in Belgium and knew nothing of my whereabouts until the war was over. However, she never gave up hope. One night at the beginning of May 1945, just 3 nights before the British Guards Division would arrive to liberate the camp, less than a week away from the unconditional surrender of all German forces, Bowen heard German machine guns firing all through the night. The machine gun fire was coming from the end of the compound where the POWs were imprisoned. Bowen knew what the gunfire signaled. They were executing the prisoners! My God, the war was ending! Only a week afterward, the Russians took Berlin. How hideous! British forces fought to liberate the POW hospital at Bremerhaven, where Bowen was prisoner. Despite the fact that the Stalag had no legitimate military value, the Germans moved a tank battalion in and around the hospital. For 2 days, the British shelled the hospital before they attacked. Once the British captured the Stalag, the Germans retaliated by shelling the place. The shelling from both sides killed approximately 25 to 30 POWs. While the Germans were still shelling the camp, Bowen was led out past the bodies of the POWs that he had heard shot a few nights before. 50 years later, he was still horrified by their senseless execution. I saw 100 or more naked bodies stacked beside some of the buildings at one end of the camp. Did this have any bearing on the fight for the stockade? I don't know. The war was less than a week from its end. Were the Germans driven by their obedience to orders, or were they so craven as to do what they could to strike back at people who they thought were inferior to them and were about to win? I don't know that either. Because of Bowen's injuries, he would spend the next 9 months in Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. until being discharged in February 1946. 50 years after the war, Bowen was still haunted by the memories of the buddies he lost. I do think of my friends who never made it home, of POWs whose true names I never knew, just Detroit or Cowboy or Sarge, who died in bombings or through disease or maltreatment. I will remember them until I die. Bowen also struggled with post-traumatic stress syndrome. I am still affected by nightmares, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and restricted use of my right wrist and a swelling in my right leg due to the operation. But as an engraver who worked for 58 years with one company, and an artist who spends much time painting things which I think are beautiful, I try to put the horrible things in my past out of my mind. That isn't always possible, of course, but it helps. The war changed my life forever. I don't wish it on anyone, no matter what country they're from. Robert and Christine Bowen did not have any children, as they were unable to. We do have, though, many grandnieces and nephews, and are close to most, he wrote in 1996. Christine stayed very active in her church, teaching Sunday school, playing the piano and organ, singing in the choir, and acting as a secretary to the president of the congregation. The couple was very close and golfed, bowled, and took nature walks together until Christine developed Alzheimer's. In his letter of March 1996, Bowen wrote, Christine is in a nursing home now for 18 months with Alzheimer's. I visit twice a day and I do what I can to make her comfortable. It has been hard to cope, more difficult than anything in the past. The irony was not lost on Bowen. He had been lost to Christine for months during World War II, and now she was lost to him. Bowen worked as a die sinker and engraved brass plates, sculpted heads of U.S. presidents, embossed letters and figures for book covers, and made many military medals, including the Medal of Honor and Purple Heart. It's a dead trade in Baltimore. I was the last to do it. Bowen was also a talented artist, having been trained at the Maryland Institute of Fine Arts and the Schuler's School of Art. His painting helped soothe the pain of his wife's Alzheimer's and his own PTSD. Having experienced so much horror in the war, Bowen painted in oils scenes of beauty, primarily seascapes and landscapes. A few of his paintings can be found on the podcast webpage, as well as photos of Robert and Christine. Robert died May 9th, 2005. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network that you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans. Our song today, I'll Be Seeing You by Vera Lynn, was a real staple during World War II, and particularly, I think, commemorates Robert and Christine Bowen, who were lost to each other during World War II when she was told that he was dead. The lyrics are from Irving Cahell, and the music by Sammy Fain. Please check out our website to see pictures of Robert and Christine, and we'll see you next time on Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes.